All right, so here we are. We're ready to dive into some Armenian church history. But first, we need to have some idea of what we're talking about. And so I would like us to consider Armenian church history. What does it mean? Now, the meaning of the phrase may seem kind of self-evident, and to talk about it's a little redundant, but I put it to you that actually that is not the case. In fact, each one of these three words is in need of clarification. And so we're going to question these words a bit. We're going to unpack them a little. We're going to see what we actually mean by them when we talk about this topic. And I want to take them in ascending order of difficulty. We'll start with the easiest one, we'll go to the medium one, then we'll end with the harder one. I'm not saying that we're going to derive satisfactory answers for any of these questions, but since unexamined terminology is not worth using, we should certainly open our mind to all the possible questions that these words raise. So, first of all, to start with the easy word, what is church? And here, if this were a real class, I would be waiting eagerly for your responses. But it's very interesting. What is church? If you Google church, or you Google Armenian church even, what comes up for you is thousands upon thousands of pictures of buildings. For a good chunk of their Christian experience, Armenians have been fortunate enough to have the opportunity to build worship spaces in a very recognizable style, exemplified by, obviously, Echmiadzin on the bottom left, and Gandzasar, the diocesan center of Artsakh, on the upper right. And Armenians all around the world, I'm sure, feel this little lift of the heart when they see an Armenian dome outlined against the sky. There's like an, that's ours, that's an Armenian church feeling. But in recent centuries, as you can see from the other pictures on the screen, picture of the Armenian churches in Detroit and Fresno on the side, pictures of the Armenian church of Isfahan in Iran, next to it, Myanmar, and thirdly, Manchester in Britain. It has not always been possible to make that beautiful traditional architectural statement. And so the question arises, A, how important is the church building? And B, how Armenian does a church structure have to be an Armenian church? And if the structure does matter, are there certain parts of it that matter more than others? How important is the Armenian church building to our understanding of the Armenian church? When we talk about Armenian church history, how much are we talking about the actual structures, the buildings that house the community of faith? Is that what we mean? Is it part of what we mean? How do we mean it? Can the church be church without sacraments and services? Without its liturgies, those beautiful archaic ceremonies, most of which take place in specially sanctified buildings like the ones we just saw. Are those ceremonies effective if performed anywhere else? Are those ceremonies essential in some way to the Armenian church's being? We might answer these questions mentally in any number of different ways, mightn't we? What about the hierarchy? Is the hierarchy church? Is the hierarchy essential to the church? Do priests and bishops and Catholicos constitute the Armenian church? Could there be an Armenian church without them? And if we say no, if we say there has to be this hierarchical structure, then the question becomes, how good how holy, how likable does a bishop have to be Armenian Church? And if one had to choose between qualities, is his holiness more important or his effectiveness and efficiency? Now, hopefully you can get the whole package, but just in case you can't. Does the point of the hierarchy lie in its unbroken succession from the apostles? Does the Armenian Church hierarchy's legitimacy lie in its unbroken succession from Gregory the Illuminator? What about those vestments? Do they matter? What do they contribute to the church's essence? Or do they? Many of you may be thinking, well, we're leaving something very important out. A priest isn't a priest by himself. A bishop has to be bishop of an Armenian community in order to be a bishop of the Armenian Church. Ceremonies don't happen without a congregation. And I'm sure many of us have seen signs like this one, because we all know that on some level, the church is the people. The church is you and me. So what does that mean? How do people become church? Are people per se the church? What's required of people in order to be church? Do they have to attend services? And if so, how often? And how long do they have to stay at each service? Is there an ethnic requirement for being part of the Armenian Church, part of the Armenian people that attend this institution? Are there skin color expectations? Language, what about that? Are people who live far away from a physical church building still part of the Armenian Church, even if they can't attend? Many, many kinds of questions like these arise when we start to think. What does it mean if we say the people are the church? What does it mean if we say that the community is the church? What does it mean to say church? And then there's always the question, how many people constitute a legitimate church? Does the building need to be full? What about half full? What's the smallest number of people with which a church can continue to function legitimately? And then there's the question of, do those people have to actually have specific beliefs in order to be part of the Armenian Church? Do they need to have any Christian faith at all? And if so, how can that be ensured or monitored? To be part of the Armenian Church, do they have to be active in the community? If so, how? To what degree? Is liking the Armenian Church, having an attachment to the Armenian Church, having it be the church of one's grandparents, and so there are these beautiful associations with it, is that enough to constitute a person's being Armenian Church? Now, these are not just random questions that I have made up for the evening. All of these questions have been asked, sometimes more than once. Some of them are still being asked across the whole span and spectrum of Armenian Christianity. And the answers, as we will see, have differed from place to place and time to time. So the term church, simple though it seems, cannot just be taken at face value. It's not the same at all times and everywhere. It's not the same in the minds of everyone. There is, in fact, no agreed definition that I know of for Armenian Church. So that was the easiest question of our three preliminary questions, of our three essential words for this and the subsequent lectures. The second easiest one, the medium one, is this. What is history? And equally important, who decides? There's that saying, history is written by the victors. Is that true? And if it's true, then how do we account for that in our reading of events, our interpreting of motivations and happenings? We may think of history as a linear development of events. One thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing, in a kind of a causal chain in which certain people are involved, from which certain results evolve, or maybe devolve, depending on the circumstances. And on one level, this is a useful idea. It helps us to kind of order things in our mind. It focuses on dates. And yeah, it's always handy to know what happened first, what happened before what. It focuses on places where things happen. It focuses on major figures. And it's on the basis of this linear view of history that we learn useful tidbits like this. Armenia became the first Christian nation in 301, which may be factual as far as it goes. But one of the interesting things about facts is that they raise many more questions than they actually answer. As we will see, large numbers of Armenians did not become Christian in 301. Or at least Armenia did not undergo a conversion in the way that we commonly understand the word conversion, seeing the light, making a 180-degree change of direction. To say that Armenia became the first Christian nation in 301 also has some implications to it that we don't always stop to consider. First, it implies that Christianity did not play a significant role there prior to that date, which is very far from the case, as we shall see. Putting a 301 date on this as an event also tends to imply that the country after 301 behaved in a recognizably, relatively unified Christian fashion from that date onwards. Whereas the process of Christianizing a probable majority of Armenians actually took centuries, from the time of the first apostolic activity in Armenia until around the 6th century. And at that point, it became a question of which Christianity does which group of Armenians follow. In short, the more that I have studied history, the less satisfying the linear paradigm has become for me. It's just too neat. History is created by the interactions of human beings, who, as we all know, are complicated creatures with limited understanding of themselves. I should say ourselves, we're included in it, let alone of the world around us. And church history is, if anything, even less neat than other kinds of history, because it involves not just the interactions of human beings as individuals, human beings as groups of various sizes, but it involves the interactions of both individuals and groups with their faith. And their actions, aka historical events, are shaped by the many ways in which they perceive their faith and the ways in which they perceive their own interactions. Plus, in addition to the human complexities, divine involvement is also acknowledged in church history. And that divine involvement doesn't seem to care about exact dates. It does not honor the divisions of centuries. It works apparently without concern for political boundaries or linear chronological unfoldment. It comes from an entirely different realm than the one limited by time and space. So, the history of the Armenian Church is the history of how individual Armenians, with their varying personalities, mental capacities, character, gifts, self-interests, fears, personalities, fortunate and unfortunate, cultural assumptions, agendas, and Armenians as a society, which has all of those considerations on a larger scale, how those very different beings have asked questions of their faith and have found working resolutions to those questions. Sometimes these are systematic, sometimes they're very ad hoc, within the limits of their practical situation at any given moment. Plus, the divine infinitude has from time to time tossed curveballs into the whole matter. So there are a lot of moving parts to this kind of history. And looking around for another way of describing history to get away from this linear paradigm, I first thought, well, history is much more like maybe a flowchart. It's not quite linear. It takes into account that there may be varying outcomes from a single motivation or choice, depending on the circumstances. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized this kind of flowchart idea only works with a single issue or a single individual or group in mind. It's not going to be satisfactory for historical developments where you have multiple actors and many, like a plethora of options. The same thing is, in a different way, also the problem with this paradigm that I played with for a while as a teaching tool for understanding how history develops. So it's a bit better because, yes, a spider's web varies in size and shape depending on what the spider has to latch it onto. So there's adaptation that goes on. But it's still the work of one spider. History is not that way. There are many spiders. So maybe it's more like this. Many spiders. But then, the more I looked at it, even when there are multiple spiders at work, each one of them with their own adaptations to the surroundings, it's still not quite adequate as a metaphor for history. Certainly not for church history, because once all the spiders are done with their weavings, the web stays the way they made it till something blunders through it. History, on the other hand, does not stay put. Once the web is woven, it takes on a life of its own and does unpredictable things. So finally, after thinking about this for years, actually, I decided that history, and especially Armenian church history, it's much more like this. It's much more like a human neuron, which is what you see in the picture. Neurons are ever changing in response to stimuli. They're adaptable. They also affect their environment. They're shaped by multiple forces. And there are almost an infinite number of them interacting at any one time. Firing, misfiring, communicating, miscommunicating, attempting to coordinate the movements of the structure around them in all its infinitely various parts. And I kind of like this one. So maybe we can think of the church and its history as a complex of living, pulsing, interacting neurons. On the one hand, mutually supportive, but also potentially mutually damaging. Neurons are always firing off transmitting information, being blocked or taken offline by little changes in the environment. And they are always morphing to reflect and to deal with whatever may be going on in their environment. Perhaps they become ill or diseased. Perhaps they overgrow. All kinds of things are possible. And each one of those affects the communication of any given neuron with any other. In terms of the church, these neurons interpret, integrate, manipulate, transmit or reject information and influences from their surroundings based on their needs and aspirations for continued liveliness. And I really like this idea because the growth patterns of neurons are not linear or orderly, as you can see. There are reasons why they look this way, but it's not orderly. And we know now that more neuronal growth occurs along the paths of greatest use. So the more that an action is repeated, the more reinforced the neural pathway becomes that allows that to happen. At the same time, the process of their proliferation, the process of their shrinkage remains mysterious and somewhat unpredictable in its complexity. And the level of functioning of this complex of neurons can be anything from extreme genius to vulnerable and precarious. And like the nervous system, the church is a delicate organic thing affected by many, many variables. And anyone who has experienced a neurological disorder or a neurological event could tell you the havoc that a small malfunction in a neuron can wreak on the organization of the organism as a whole. And the same is certainly true in the history of the church. One of the many things that the Armenian church's neuronal system has had to adapt to constantly, one of the things that has served to keep the Armenian church on its toes, growing, morphing, and changing, or at least trying to do so, over the entire course of its history, is the subject of our third question. What is Armenia? And where might it be? Exactly. Well, the logical question that immediately arises is, what do we mean by Armenia? Do we mean a land mass? Do we mean a governmental entity? Do we mean an ethnic population? Or some configuration of those three together? This is really worth looking at in quite a bit of detail. If we mean a landmass, there are certain dependable qualities that characterize the features of physical land. It doesn't really matter what name, what political name may be attached to them, but lakes don't often change size and location, although if we decide to carry on with series like this and we eventually get to Nersa Snorali's time, we will see that lakes do from time to time disappear or shrink in ways that can be very humbling for a historian. Maybe mountains are a better example. Mountains are where they are for long periods of time, even in a volcanic region like the Southeast Caucasus, Eastern Anatolia. And looking at the topography of this area more closely, this area that has been consistently and densely populated by Armenians, where every single lump on that map is a mountain or a range of mountains, you have to stop and think, what effect would this landscape have on the history of the church? What would it be like to be a hierarch in this landscape? What would it be like to be responsible for the worship and spiritual life of Armenian communities tucked into the folds of those mountains? What kind of issues might a hierarch have to deal with in this kind of terrain? First of all, from the organizational point of view, what about centralization? Can it happen even in a landscape like this? Where would you put the center? What about infrastructure? Roads for communication, roads for trade. In this kind of a landscape, there are really only so many places that you can put them without running into extraordinary engineering problems and huge expense. What kind of communities will a hierarch be dealing with? Are these urban communities in such a landscape? There's a reason Armenians have not traditionally had the rank of metropolitan in their church hierarchy, because where in the world are you going to put a metropolis in this very folded and crumpled landscape? And these are important questions because trade and communication determine what a hierarch can potentially do, what resources he may actually have, how he interacts or competes with the non-church entities in his area, where there are limited avenues for resources. Relationships may be much more fraught. What about the climate? This is a landscape that imposes definite time limits within which activity has to be carried out. In this region, pretty much nothing could happen between November and March, nor could one undertake travel in that time period in the winter, except for dire emergencies. Now, of course, that has changed somewhat now because we have plane travel, we have other types of transportation. But in antiquity and the Middle Ages, these are serious questions. How are you going to arrange your schedule to be able to visit with the communities that are under your jurisdiction and do it within that time window? What do you do with the rest of your time? How do you assign clergy in this kind of an area? So the land, in its stability, imposes certain conditions on life. And while these are more or less stable, the same cannot be said for the political and cultural entities that lay over its surface boundaries, artificial limits, to secure and perpetuate their own interests and agendas. No judgment on that, whether those agendas are positive or negative. So, keeping in mind the stability of the land itself as soil, as mountain, as river, let me show you what the political entity of Armenia has looked like over the centuries that we are examining in this series. And I want you to keep, as we go through these maps somewhat slowly, I would like you to keep your eye on the peach-colored section of the map, because that is political Armenia. All of these maps are taken from the late Professor Robert Hewson's magnificent Atlas of Armenia. If you have it, I'm sure you prize it. If you don't have it, I saw it recently for sale for 124 Canadian dollars, which is an absolute steal. So if you would like to own one, that's a possibility. It's wonderful. On the one side of the page, it has historical information. On the other side, extremely detailed maps. So here we have Armenia as it was in the 1st century BC. And as you can see, that long, thin, greater Armenia peach area is massive. It's a semi-imperial looking state, including much more outside the traditional areas of population than we are used to seeing. So it's this Armenia that pertains prior to Christianity, just prior to the time of Christ. So remember the length and the size of the peach area. And let's move into a map of the Armenian state in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So now we're thinking about what it looks like in the time of the successors of the apostles, in the time that St. Gregory is born, St. Gregory the Illuminator. And as you can see, all those areas that were down towards the left corner of the screen, all of those areas that were outside the mountainous plateau regions have fallen off. So what would be the repercussions of that? In Armenia, in an age of activity by the apostles and their successors, there are stranded Armenian populations left out in these once Armenian-controlled areas. And as you can see, the vacuum has been filled by the purple territory to the left of the screen, the Imperium Romanum. Those territories have been taken into the lands directly belonging to Rome. Rome is in Italy. Why do the Romans care what's happening out here? Why would they bother to take this territory other than, the obvious thing, well, they can. Persia is the reason. You can see on the right lower corner, the Imperium Partorum, the Parthian Empire, the nemesis of the Romans, and vice versa. So from the Armenian point of view, as they're sitting there in their peach area between these two empires, what does the proximity of Roman imperial forces and settlers mean for the Armenian kingdom? Well, it means you have to know some Latin. It means you need to cater to the Roman will. It means you need to do things that are pleasing to them in order to obtain benefits from them, not to have them in a hostile state. At the same time, you have to do similar things for the Parthians. So Armenia, in this time period, the time period when Christianity is just beginning in Armenia, is a time that requires diplomatic balance and skill. Remember the shape, remember the size. You see the three lakes, Lake Sevan, Lake Van, Lake Urmia. And let's move into the 4th century. What has happened? Lake Van, that was kind of in the middle of Armenian territory, no longer is in the middle. It's on the edge. Persia is bigger. Greater Armenia has things in it that are not Greater Armenia. It has independent or semi-independent enclaves within it, making governance that much harder. As St. Gregory and his clan run and form the church, this is what Armenia looks like. And here it is again. The difference? between something that's quite spread out east to west, even though it's diminished from what it originally was, to something that's consolidated in the middle. And those little independent areas have become independent areas. They've broken away. So as we come through the Grigorid Catholicosates, several generations of leaders, we notice that actually, look at that, there is no Armenia. Even though you have a peach area and it's called Persian Armenia, Pers Armenia, it's Persian. So in the time of Avarayr and Kirikud, the discovery, the invention of the Armenian alphabet, there is really no independent Armenia. There's Armenia as a province of Persia, and there's what used to be Armenia, but now it's part of the Byzantine Empire. What about that kind of challenge to the church's influence? And here it is again. Now, you look at this and you go, well, okay, that looks better, yeah? It's not as truncated, it's not as square. Now we have some of those little appendages out to the side have come back. Yay, this is good. And then you look at it and you go, wait a minute, what are those Roman numerals doing on the map? You see a 2, a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4. 1 out to the right near the Caspian Sea, 2 up near the Georgian border, 3 in the center of the country, and 4 out to the edge. And then you realize this is the 7th century, right after the Islamic push into Armenian territory. So yes, what's recognized as Armenia is bigger, but it's divided into 4 Islamic provinces. Armenia has become, once again, someone else's political entity. And then just for a preview of coming attractions, I want to show you what Armenia looks like around the time of Krikor Naregatsi. We won't be talking about that in this lecture series, but I thought you might like to see it. Where is the peach area? Lake Van. There it is. What's happened? Lake Van is in the Byzantine Empire. What about Lake Urmia? It's all the way, not even in Persia, but in the Buaid Emirate. Lake Sevan. There's Lake Sevan, and there's peach around it, thank God. The province of Syunik becomes the only independent Armenian entity on the plateau. How confusing is this? How much change is this in what for global history is a very short span of time? There is constant change in what Armenia means. So if the size and the location of the political entity known as Armenia have changed continuously over time, what effects might this have on the church? How might these changes affect people's daily lives? How might these changes affect people's faith? How is the exercise of authority by bishops helped or hindered? For example, if travel documents are required for visiting a certain population of Armenians in an area that was once Armenia, how often do you get to travel there? How are you going to meet the needs of people who, although they are the same people, although they have roots, perhaps grandparents, great-grandparents who lived in an Armenian political entity, who now are in separate countries, as far as the political map is concerned. What happens, say you do get your visa and you can go to that area. What happens when you do get your travel documents and when you get there, the people that you're visiting, the Armenians that you are visiting, the faithful of your church whom you are visiting, are primarily speakers of a different language. And maybe they have some recollection of Armenian, maybe their grandparents spoke Armenian to them. But their actual language of life is Greek or Persian or something else. You see that these problems that we will be looking at in the history of the ancient and medieval church sound remarkably familiar. What problems can arise for a bishop or a Catholicos who is resident in one political entity, trying to collect money, receive funds, get support from Armenians living in what is at that moment another country and a hostile country to the one in which he lives himself? What about church disciplinary enforcement when the population is divided between different countries? Even something as simple as, what about music? How does it change according to the surrounding culture? And we'll see that at one point in church history, this is a serious issue. And then we can go, what about this? What about that? Everything in the Armenian church is affected by the political boundaries. And those boundaries have nothing actually to do with Armenia. And very often nothing to do with Armenians. It's someone else's agenda, someone else's entity that runs the show within which the church has to function as best it can. So, to do a kind of a sketchy little overview of the time period that we're going to look at, Armenian Christianity begins its 4th century development by bringing together Christian impulses from various areas around itself and trying to create for those impulses to gel around a central organizational component. And in the very early years of the church, that central organizational nexus is Krikor Pahlavuni, Gregory the Illuminator, and his entourage, on the one hand. And on the other hand, kind of layered on top of that or around it, they had to negotiate whether it was on top of, underneath, or around, Turdadar Shaguni and his entourage. So you have the issue of what is the church compared to the state, what is the state, what's the relationship between the two of them, as a very lively issue. And over the course of that century, Gregory and his immediate successors, collectively known to us as the Grigorid dynasty, pursued very vigorous evangelism within Armenia, as well as among its nearest neighbors and its political allies. And so you stop and think, well, what was the motivation for this? Is it because there are far-flung Armenian populations in what used to be Armenia but now isn't? Is the motivation for this evangelization push spiritual? Is it political? Is it dynastic? Is it some combination of those things? And at the same time, various methods of power sharing between the church and the state, the putatively Christian state, are being tried one after the other with varying degrees of success. By the 5th century, Armenian Christianity has established itself as a network of faith-based institutions and communities encompassing most of what used to be Armenia. Not everywhere, because the terrain did not permit it to be everywhere. And the situation of being split between Byzantium on the west and Persia on the east made things vastly more complicated. As we'll see, each section, the Byzantine section and the Persian section, for a while retained a titular Armenian king, but those kings effectively did not rule. It was the most they could do to stay alive. What happens when the state with which the church is trying to interact is weakened to the point of non-existence? And that wasn't the only issue in this time period. Despite the fact that there was a pretty comprehensive network of Christian things around them, Armenians were still grappling with how to integrate their former rather syncretistic religious mentality with the single-minded faith that Christian thinking inculcates in people. Christianity does not play nicely with other religions mostly. It wants to be the exclusive. And there were many people who didn't see that as a good thing, who wanted to combine Christianity. They were happy with Christianity, but they wanted to combine it with their previous cults. Or maybe they wanted to make Christianity one component of a more inclusive religious pantheon. And in addition to that, there were people who felt that Christianity is just not for them, Armenians, who wanted to separate themselves from the Christianization process. It's fine for those who want it. We would like to opt out. These people, many of them wanted to join Zoroastrian Persia, with whom the Armenians had long-standing cultural, linguistic, political ties. And kind of at the far other end of the spectrum, there were many convinced Christians who felt that Armenia should increase its ties to Byzantium, which was its nearest Christian neighbor, and which controlled a large part of its traditional territory, even though Byzantine political and cultural agendas were often not in sync with the Armenian ones. And as you know, in the middle of the 5th century, several events made it clear that Armenia was going to choose to go its own Christian way. It's going to be neither Byzantine nor Persian. One is the Council of Chalcedon, which takes place all the way off the left end of this map, and the other, the Battle of Avarayr, which takes place near the right. And it's interesting to see that neither of these events felt decisive at the moment that it happened. But people looking back on these events recognize that, in fact, they were watershed times. The Council of Chalcedon separated the Armenian church from Byzantine Christianity and thus from the Byzantine Empire. And the Battle of Avarayr separated it from the Persian Empire. So even though parts of Armenia are going to continue to interact with both of those empires, and some regions are going to physically belong to one of those empires or the other, Armenians are never again going to fit wholeheartedly within either empire's mental or physical boundaries. And also in the middle of the 5th century, as we'll look at in much more detail in a couple of weeks, a very small group, random group of Armenians, led by a triumvirate consisting of the last Catholicos from St. Gregory's line, a priest, civil servant, former military man known to his friends as Mesrop, and an accidental sovereign who took the politically correct name Vramshapu, created an alphabet for the Armenian language, and began a concentrated effort to formulate an educational system and a body of literature that would be distinctly Christian Armenian, even while incorporating the best of other Christian traditions. Then throughout the 6th century, Armenian Christianity is going to continue to flesh out its own personality, consolidate its identity, and in the process move farther away from the mental and spiritual influence of the Byzantine Church, which was its nearest Christian neighbor, its closest spiritual cousin, and the Persians, who are their closest cultural cousin. Now, as the gap between the Armenians and the Byzantines gets wider and wider from both sides, Armenia's neighbors and closest natural allies, the Georgians, who are up there at the top of the map in the light peach, chose their relationship with Byzantium over their relationship with Armenia. And there was a very, very painful divorce between the two countries, the repercussions of which we still experience today. And this painful separation caused Armenian theologians to re-examine the idea of church, to re-examine what unity in the church means, what's possible and what is not. And some Armenians in this time period chose to opt out of the independent development of Armenian Christianity and to go into full participation with the Byzantine Church. And so you have substantial pockets of Armenian Chalcedonian believers maintaining a Byzantine form of worship, both within the borders of the Byzantine territory, the purple to the left, and within Armenia itself. And among these people who prefer the Byzantine tradition are laity and clergy, including bishops. So you have a rather messy landscape right before you have the Arab invasions, the Islamic invasions, where significant numbers of Armenian Christians are actually Byzantine Christians. And you can imagine that this would make for some awkward dinner table conversation at the very least. In the 7th century comes a turning point in Armenian history, both secular and religious. And Armenia became gradually incorporated into the newly forming Islamic Empire. And while this assimilation was going on, the Armenian church had to seriously consider, take cognizance of, new theological developments in the lives of other Christian communities at the same time that they were also weighing the possibilities of rapprochement or entente, or some way of getting along with a non-Christian body. So at the same time that they're considering how much alliance can we, should we, ought we to have with this new invading power, nobody could foresee how long the Islamic presence was going to last in Armenia. Theology, thinking about icons, thinking about the image of God, caused Armenians to formulate their own unique positions on these other issues. It was a very difficult, uncomfortable, and at the same time, theologically fruitful time. And as if that wasn't enough, as the organized church is considering all of these pressing questions, grassroots Christian movements, both in Byzantium and in Armenia, movements that are comprised of people who wanted a return to primitive Christianity, who wanted a return to the simpler Christianity of the New Testament without any kind of hierarchy, without any kind of structures, without vestments, without sacraments, any of that, opted out of the mainstream Armenian church and challenged the church to explain itself. Why do we need structures? What is the purpose of sacrament and liturgy? Why do we have hierarchs? Who do they have to be? The primitive Christian church didn't have any of these, they argued. So you have to justify to us why we need them now. Again, a very, very uncomfortable time for the organized church, as it had to truly examine itself and understand not just that we have always done it this way, this is why we have these things, but to think why, to offer explanations, to open its mind to the deeper reasons behind its own ceremonial life. And this 7th century transfer of power in Armenia to the caliphate and to its representatives was a critical moment for the development of Armenian identity as Armenians gradually settled into the up and down kind of erratic rhythm of a life where they were treated as dhimmi in their own ancestral provinces. But that adjustment we will consider later if we go on. And as we saw, by the time you get to Grigor-Naragatsi's time, most of Armenian territory was in the process of being engulfed within the Byzantine Empire to such a degree that only the province of Syunik, which we will talk in much more detail about next week, remains autonomous. So it appears from that very quick overview that a large portion of Armenian church history takes place, including some of the most pivotal events for that church history, without an Armenian state, or with maybe a variety of truncated Armenian states. And so we have to consider, how does that affect the church's role? It raises so many questions, difficulties, and problems. The church does not have the luxury, in this or any other time period actually, of being fully in its own head. It doesn't have the luxury of being able to sit and mystically speculate most of the time. It has to deal with the practicalities of life. It has to deal with the actual shepherding of real human beings who may be in very strange circumstances. How does that change, that need to focus on the concrete? How does that change the nature, the flavor of the Armenian church relative to others of its cousins? So lots and lots and lots and lots of questions. But I also want to say one other thing about maps. We are people who live in a heliocentric planetary system. We live on a round planet, a spherical planet. And so we know from a very early time in our lives, practically as soon as we go to school and start experiencing little bits of science, that the world has no physical center. You can't point to a spot on the surface of the globe and go, that's the middle. You really can't. It's round. It's a sphere. So where one is becomes where one measures life from. And so effectively, where we are becomes our own personal or our own group center, from which everything else in our experience radiates outward. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea that American schools teach an America-centric view of the world. Europeans do the same. Asians do the same. And everyone, especially these days, is slightly offended that the others marginalize them or peripheralize them by not acknowledging the importance of their center. This is a problem that the ancient world did not have. People were not always 100% convinced as to whether the earth was rounded or flat. But in antiquity, the earth was limited. The known world of Armenians around the time of Christ, the apostles, even St. Gregory the Illuminator, was not our known world by any means. So the map that you are looking at is based on the geography of the 2nd century Alexandrian astronomer, geographer, and mathematician Claudius Ptolemy. What do you see? This is the entire landmass known. Everything else, everything off the edge, was the Great Sea kind of the continuation of the blue. If you look at the upper left, you can see that there's a lot of writing along there, but really that blue just went on and on and on. No one knew how big it was. It was menacingly uncharted. It was unmeasured. It might be measureless. And that body of water, that amorphous body of water, surrounded what was effectively the great habitable island that we see here. So you can see off to the left, if you kind of look at it a little bit slanted, you can see Spain and Italy, Britain. The European continent is pretty good there. You can see Greece with its little Peloponnese Peninsula. You can see what later becomes Turkey. The Arabian Peninsula is there. There are some rivers and things in North Africa. You can kind of see the shape of that. You can see India, farther to the right, Ceylon. And then it kind of gets fuzzy when you get out into Southeast Asia. They know it's there. They know it's complicated. They know it's big. China is there. You can see the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean Sea, in other words, the ocean that is surrounded by Earth in media terra. And this is it. This is the world. This world does have a center. And fortunately for us, this is a 2-page map. So the crease goes through the center. Where's the center of this world? It's in Persia. So very close to the center of the ancient world stood Armenia. And I think it's very important, even critically important, to keep Armenia's central location in mind, to keep its centrality in mind, as we begin next week to look at the roots by which the newly founded faith of Jesus Christ, Son of God, entered Armenia. Because from our point of view, as we live in the West, Armenia is peripheral. It's way out there. And to our mind, it's like, wow, the apostles made it all the way there. Well, no, not exactly. Those who brought the good news to Armenia, to Armenians, were not seeking out the ends of the world. They were not going for the margins. They were heading for the center. And I think that will change greatly how we view the activities of those apostles. And that's what we will be looking at next week.